Imagine the government just coming in and taking your home because they need it. Sounds like something that happens in a country with an oppressive government, not in America. You might think the government taking your property would be unconstitutional, as the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution clearly prohibits unreasonable search and seizure. But the very next amendment, the Fifth Amendment, grants the government the power to take land for public use with just compensation. And for over 200 years now, to this very day, there have been court battles over their power and your rights. MeTV's Veronica Dudo takes a closer look at the government power of eminent domain.
Cities across the country have been using eminent domain to force people off their land. Through the process, the government can take private property for public use. Here in Philadelphia, a world-renowned artist is fighting back.
My story is a tragic one, but it's not alone.
Pittsburgh native James Dupre is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He has traveled the world to create art, curate shows, and exhibit his masterpieces. His works are in the permanent collections of several museums abroad and featured in the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the African American Museum in Philadelphia. In 2010, Dupre was the recipient of the Living Legends School of Design Award from the University of Pennsylvania. Not long after, he received life-altering news. The deed to his property was taken because of eminent domain.
Now they have a law to take my free and clear deed, my property, 34 years into my 35-year dream studio, built with my own two hands, my own money, didn't ask anybody for anything.
Under the power of eminent domain, a state or national government can take private property for public use, which includes delegation to third parties who will devote it to public or civic use, or in some cases, to economic development. Here on Haverford Avenue in the Mantua section of the city, Dupre has built his life dream, a unique art studio, museum, gallery, and residence. But now he could lose everything.
It has never been about the money for me. It has been about the principle that our city government would act so egregiously on taxpayers. I've worked really hard. I cannot build this again.
According to a spokesperson from the Office of Housing and Community Development, there are still plans in place for this area that would include a supermarket, which officials say is needed.
There is no supermarket developer or plans for one to happen at this location.
It's been a long battle for Dupre, who has dealt with depression and a stroke as a result of the legal dispute. As an artist, he has embraced his feelings to create art that represents his emotions.
The last 7 years of my life have been hell. You wake up every day living a life of uncertainty. The symbols are my pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering is for all those that cannot and do not have the means. This law kills people.
Currently, Dupre is still in litigation with the city and says he hopes officials will return his deed so he can again be the lawful owner of his property. In Philadelphia, I'm Veronica Dudo for MeTV.
All right, thank you, Veronica. Now I want you to meet Joe Danheld. Joe lost his home. How long ago?
I lost the house in 1994. I bought the house from the government in 1991.
So Joe lost his house that many years ago, more than 20 years ago, to eminent domain. And he has since been fighting for the just compensation that is promised to him in the U.S. Constitution. Let's talk about first how you came upon this house. How did you buy this house?
I saw the house in an ad as a handyman special, and I asked the realtor, and he said it's a HUD house. And I went, and checked everything out. I knew it was in an area near the Logan area, so I went down.
And near Roosevelt Boulevard, right?
Yeah. And I went down to Logan Assistance, which was the government office down the street, and they said, no, they aren't taking your house, the house that you're looking at buying. And then I went back to the realtor. I talked to somebody who represented themselves from HUD, and I bought the house the way a normal person buys a house. It just needed a lot of repairs.
So you bought it for how much?
I bought the house for $6,000.
$6,000, and then you had to bring the house up to code. That was
Right.
part of the agreement. How much money did you put into the house?
I put $20,000 worth of building materials plus labor, so it was about $35,000. I had to do all the roofs, 3 outside doors, about 40 windows. I
So
had to
you're
put the glass.
$41,000 into this house, and the house isn't just a single residence. It's a row home, and you were going to rent some apartments, right?
Well, I was going to live in 2 of the apartments, and I was going to rent the other apartment, and I had 2 storefronts on the side in the basement. It was an end of the row.
So you're thinking to yourself, I got a pretty good deal. I just had to put some time and effort into
Right.
it. You had to borrow money to do this,
Right.
and your life's going to be set because you're now going to rent the properties out, maybe start a business that's going to be out of there. This was not just a property. This was something that you were going to build a life around.
Right. And
And
I
then-
even had a tenant.
And
I
then
ev-
they took it from you.
I even had a tenant. They paid my tenant to leave, but they still haven't paid me for the house.
What did they tell you when they took it from you?
Well, they didn't take it from me. They brought
you
me
don't have
down
it
to
anymore.
Logan. They brought me down to Logan Assistance, and they made me an offer of 60 plus 20 relocation money. If I turned over the keys to them, they would pay me later. They said that if you pay the taxes and the water bills, we'll reimburse you for them and your expenses and interest when we make settlement with you, because the government money's coming in bits and pieces. So I handed them the keys because the alternative was to live there with no water. They shut
I
the
got it.
water off to the neighborhood. So I really didn't have a choice. And I didn't want to stay and fight. I just wanted to get paid.
What do they want to do with your land now?
They want to build a shopping mall there.
And that's been pretty well publicized that they're putting-
Three malls have been planned for the area.
So this is area that you were moved off of because it was,
Valuable.
well, it
To
was also-
someone else.
It was considered unlivable too.
Right.
You shouldn't build on it because of the soil, and that's why they move you out. And now they're going to build on it and invite people to come there. So what you believe, and you say it, not me, I want to put words in your mouth, they took your land because your land was valuable.
Correct, because there's government reports that show that the block I was on has no fill on it. I was 3 blocks from the creek. So if I was 3 blocks from the creek is going to eat, if you go in proportion, Delaware River is wider than a creek, then there should be no building next to Delaware clear up to City Hall if you want to go proportionate where you can't build near water. My house has no fill, and that's from the Lippincott study that was published in the paper that was paid for by the city. But they're taking it because they don't want bits and pieces in the middle of the land. They want a big triangular lot on Roosevelt Boulevard.
Right, because it's right off Roosevelt Boulevard. It's valuable property, especially if you run a business. For a shopping mall, it would be perfect, yet you should be getting compensation, and you are constitutionally they have a constitutional responsibility to give you compensation.
Right. They should have to prove that I'm satisfied before they can change my title. And it's quite the opposite. They beat me up, stalked me, made me go into debt, everything else, and they haven't given me a dime, and yet they say this is constitutional, and I argue no, it isn't.
Well, I hope we can work it out. We're going to have an attorney and a real estate expert up next. We'll talk about your case a little bit. I hope somebody sees this, either from the city who feels the moral obligation to do the right thing, or an attorney that would take your case and for payment down the line.
Yeah, I've been turned down by the ACLU, and I've been turned down by, there's a lot of legal groups that take on eminent domain, and they've all turned down my case because they said they got mired in one of the Logan Triangle cases before, and the government is impossible to deal with in Philadelphia.
And yet, the basis of your story is inherently unfair. So I hope that somebody feels the moral obligation to help you. Thank you so much,
Thank
Joe.
you so much.
I hope this all works out for you. And we'll continue to talk about not only Joe's case, but eminent domain when we return on And Another Thing. We continue our conversation on eminent domain now with Stuart Letterman, who is an attorney in New Jersey who specializes in eminent domain, and Vincent White, who is a commercial broker, and he's also former president of the Newcastle County Board of Realtors. I want to talk specifically about the constitutionality of eminent domain and how it happens. But first, we just heard from Joe Daniels. And I know you don't know, and I don't know the intricacies of his case. There's always two sides of a story. But from what you heard, can you comment?
Well, I think, first of all, it's very important. Each case is different. But when government is dealing with individuals and businesses in the eminent domain sense, it's required to turn 4 squares with each of those individuals. That's required by both the federal constitution and the constitutions of every state in the nation. So if in his case the government didn't turn 4 squares, and it sounded like you had 2 government entities dealing with it. You had the city of Philadelphia dealing with it, and then you had the federal government with HUD, that somewhere their wires were crossed, and they may not have turned 4 square corners with him. In that situation, it's horrible. When I've represented the condemnor, and I represent both condemnors and property owners, when I'm dealing with a condemnor, I tell my clients, you have to turn 4 squares. We have to deal fairly with individuals. We have to pay people just compensation for the taking. That's required by the Constitution. We also have to follow, depending on where the taking is, if it's within a state, the State Relocation Act, or if it's a federal project, the Federal Relocation Act, which also gives not only people just compensation for their property, but if their residents, for example, help them relocate to somewhere else. Sometimes that place is a better place than they were in. With businesses, again, you have to help with relocation. You have to help them move. Right. But it's an obligation of the government to deal fairly with people, because this is the greatest power the government has.
No, and that was well said. And Vincent, I think you would agree from hearing his story, those things, and again, we don't know the entire story, but those things did not happen in his case. Yeah. And it always seems to happen to guys like him.
Well, I think the broader conversation is that it does happen. Where does it happen most? Does it happen in areas that most social economically deprived areas, which has been the history of condemnation in eminent domain? And that population, for whatever reason, does not quite understand as that someone's going to come in and take your property for public good. The question, though, is the compensation.
This doesn't seem to happen on the main line. Well, this doesn't seem to happen in rich areas. This does seem to happen to people like Joe who can't fight it.
When you're dealing with redevelopment, which the government decided years ago, and people voted for this, and voted in people who supported redevelopment in local areas. It was initially considered urban redevelopment, and it was a tool that everybody wanted. The reality is that at the time, and still sometimes today, the people who are in those areas in need of redevelopment are sometimes the abject poor or do not have the same funds as someone, for example, on the main line. When you're talking about redevelopment, but eminent domain is often used for other things, and sometimes it does happen on the main line.
Shopping mall? I mean, if a shopping mall ends up at this place, that smells bad. Right? I'm getting deeper into this case than I wanted to, but that does smell bad.
Probably as the one person who has actually lived through condemnation, I think my family was relocated from the east side of Wilmington back in the 60s for urban redevelopment. We were forced to move to the west side. That whole conversation is that it does mostly happen in areas of low to moderate income people. Now, there's probably a reason for that. One, land values are less resistance to the process, a less understanding of the process. And for whatever reason, there's political influences, in a condemnation and an eminent domain taking. But I think the broader question has got to be that it's a tool and rightfully used for the public good, as spelled out in state and national constitution. It's a good tool, only if you apply the compensation justly and fairly.
Can you fight eminent domain? Can you be successful in fighting it?
Certainly, yes, you can. I mean, the first thing, if your property is being taken, the key is to learn as much as you can about the plans that the government has. And the government is required to hold public hearings on all of these projects. Attend those public hearings, go to them. You can fight it at that level. You can also fight it by voting people out who want to do it. The other way is you can challenge the public purpose. Since Kelo, which was some argue was the bellwether case. The United States said, yes, you could take private land and then turn it into another private purpose effectively. Most states in the United States have passed more restrictive condemnation rules that prohibit local entities from taking property in those situations.
Do you think that people can fight eminent domain, or does it happen?
There's no doubt.
If they gather together, right?
One person.
Really?
We're sitting 2 blocks from a restaurant called Libby's. Libby's was condemned in the early 80s. This land where we're sitting at right now was going to be given to the News Journal as a new operations. It was going to be given to them because they were here, they relocated. Well, they were here and then they threatened to relocate. Libby, that restaurant, that owner fought that it was not truly for public use and won. The News Journal is now located out on Basin Road and the area remains undeveloped.
Huh. Thanks for coming in, Vincent.
Thank you.
It's Stuart Letterman, who is an attorney in New Jersey, what's your law firm?
Riker Danzig.
Riker Danzig, and also Vincent Weiss, a commercial
Patterson Woods
broker.
Commercial Properties.
But is it now?
I'm with Patterson Woods Commercial Properties.
Got it. We'll be right back with the roundtable. Welcome back. I'm Larry Menti. We continue our discussion now with the roundtable. Ellen Kaloje, Dawn Stensland-Menti. Let's talk about the midterms because everybody else is. What do they mean?
I don't think there are any big surprises, and I think that, well, for us, maybe there aren't huge surprises. Maybe the White House had some surprises, but I think actually what it means is people are sick and tired of the way things are, and they want to change. And so I think that that's the biggest message.
But I would argue that the surprise is how many Republican seats changed, and it could go as high as 57 when all the votes are counted, and the House and the governor's races. I mean, there's blue states, Massachusetts, Maryland.
Maryland was a big one, right?
It is amazing. But now what happens? Does it mean that Washington's going to work?
Oh God, no, I don't think that'll ever happen. But right now, I just love the whole fact that so many of these candidates ran away from President Obama. So many of them did not want him campaigning, and the whole controversy with Harry Reid, I can only describe it as delicious to a conservative that thinks, wow, I mean, Harry Reid just skewered him. I mean, he was so upset with the president, and he just sounded like a petulant child, though. I mean, that's not unusual for Harry Reid.
Let me make the Democratic argument that they ran away from him and they lost. That had they embraced health care, that had they embraced improvements in the economy, maybe they would have done better. Maybe they would have held on to more seats.
There is a message because so many of these politicians are career politicians. And so what they fear most is being booted, being fired by their public, by their constituents. And so it was like the Donald Trump, you're fired. And so I think that's a good thing for all politicians in general, that if you anger people and you don't serve them well, and that you're just being a party loyalist as opposed to being loyal to the people who put you in office, you're going to be fired.
Yeah, and before we get too carried away and saying it was a big Republican wave, we have to point out that the map did favor the Republicans because the seats that were up, many of the seats were Democrats in traditionally Republican states. The map switches in 2016. And so it was exactly the opposite. So it could be a real bad year for Republicans if they blow these next 2 years. But that's for another round.
I just can't wait to see how Mitch McConnell does and how Harry Reid handles the whole thing because he's not used to not being in charge. So it'll be fascinating to see how he handles that.
Yeah, no, it'll be. I'm sorry, I was looking down here only because I wanted to make sure I got the names right for this next story, and I'm talking about the little boy that was killed in Chester County.
I have a hard time talking about
tortured
this without
and
filling up.
Beaten to death just for not eating his dinner by 31-year-old Jillian Tate and 23-year-old Gary Fellenbaum, and the little boy's name is Scott, and his picture is heartbreaking, and I'm sure we'll show it, and then you can feel the same way we do. We're all parents. Wanted to just get immediate reactions from you when you heard the story.
Try to picture this. So you have 3 adults. You have right in a trailer park. So you think of that these trailer homes are closer together. It's hard for me to believe that nobody heard anything or heard this little boy crying.
And his 6-year-old brother, who was also beaten, so it can't.
And then there's an 11-month-old baby. So the two there, you have a married couple that are going through a divorce.
living
So
together.
there's another mom there with an 11-month-old who's charged with child endangerment, witnessed this abuse by the couple, by the dad and the girlfriend, and did nothing to stop it. And to me, I'm thinking, you're a mom and you're only being charged with child.
And you don't know, maybe she was scared to
culpable.
death. Maybe she was scared.
Baloney.
I'm just saying, I'm not defending her, but I'm just saying, I can't wrap my mind around, and I talked to Larry about this earlier. Are we seeing more of this because our culture and our society has become so soulless and, more sociopaths who have no feeling and no empathy for people? Like, I can't wrap my mind around. I try to explain to my children when you try to explain evil, like Hitler or Osama bin Laden, how somebody, like you're saying, could do this.
Real quick, let's wrap this up. Death penalty for these two if they're found guilty?
Well, people are pushing for the death penalty. I'm not a
against the
huge
death
proponent
penalty,
of the
but-
death penalty. I say release them into the prison population.
Let them
and
deal
let
with
them have prison justice.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm normally against the death
But
penalty.
if there's a case that cries out for the death penalty, if that was my child and somebody did anything even remotely
Right.
like this, I just feel like you can't play God at any role in life. But that's
There
my
are
religious
exceptions
beliefs,
to every rule. There are
correct.
exceptions to every rule. I covered John Wayne Gacy. And I thought to myself, how can I morally or rationally argue that this man shouldn't be put to death?
Right.
And I feel the same way about these two.
And if there is a
There's no
poster
moral
children for the
ration-
death penalty, it would be these two.
Exactly. We'll be back after this.
Hi, I'm Colt Sebastian Taylor, adventurer, entrepreneur, amateur scaredy cat. Matt, scary movies. Do you like them?
I love them.
Love them.
I am scared of scary movies.
Not really. No.
I'd rather watch kid movies and stuff.
Yeah, like Shrek.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not scary.
Oh.
No. What makes a scary movie a scary movie?
It's got to be suspenseful.
It's a combination of the unknown and lots of blood and gore.
Blood and gore. The chasing and the screaming.
The people in it. Like the scary masked people. Something creepy. Maybe a doll.
When a girl turns into the devil, or her hair flips up in the air, or something crazy like that.
If you were in a scary movie, would you survive it, or would you kind of bite it halfway through?
Bite it halfway through. I'd be the first one killed.
If there was like 10 people and I was the fastest, yes, I would.
Okay, so your survivability is based purely on speed.
Yes.
Okay, so she would like go check the car for some soda and never come back, and you would be like, oh man, I can't believe we survived it. Spear through the heart. What skill set do you feel would have you survive a scary movie?
The fact that I'm wearing tennis shoes and I can run really fast.
I'm smart and I'm going to leave everyone else behind.
Okay, you're smart and you have no emotional attachments to anyone else. What are you scared of that other people aren't scared of?
Clowns. Deathly afraid of clowns.
Bats.
So a bat clown would be you two be out of town. Snakes,
Very much so.
centaurs, half man, half horse.
No, but that would be cool to see one.
That would be cool to see one. Babies that speak Latin.
Yes, that would be terrifying.
Mummers.
Stink bugs.
Really? Why are stink bugs scary?
I don't know, man.
A lawnmower with the brain of a human man.
I think that'd be pretty weird.
Dolphins with human hands.
Probably.
No.
Guys who wear tank tops and shorts in winter.
Oh yeah. There's something wrong with them.
Bats, clowns, bat clowns. I'm even more afraid now. Well, I'm Colt Sebastian Taylor, and I'll see you later.